an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we go. It is Tuesday, the 16th day of May, 2023. Welcome in. Dave Trafford here. It's Now and Next for Story Studio Network. We are here Monday to Thursday with this particular show. And then on Friday, we round out the week with On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. There'll be plenty to talk about with the On the Ledge crew Friday, no question. The Premier standing up and saying, guys, it's a good idea, let's let Peel go it alone. Or Mississauga go it alone, and what'll happen to the rest of Peel region. So there'll be a few things to talk about there. Keith Leslie, John Wright will be here. And on Thursday, of course, it is feed drop day here. So we'll hit you with the news of the day. And then we're going to continue featuring the first show we produced in the Story Studio Network. And that is the roundtable called The Next Normal. And I just noticed my calendar. We had our first production meeting 2 years ago Friday, this week. So a lot's gone on since then. And in this episode, if I'm not mistaken, Sarah Thorne at Decision Partners will lead the discussion on lessons learned and opportunities that came back in terms of building back better as far as COVID was concerned. Now remember, that conversation happened 2 years ago. Did we learn anything? Are we actually building back better, taking advantage of those opportunities? That and more coming up on Thursday. But here we are, the morning after. Yeah, the morning after. It's a sort of a routine in this city, and it has become sort of locker clear-out day, pretty much. What's going to happen to the Leafs and certainly Kyle Dubas and Sheldon Keefe and the Core Four and all. Oh, my God. You know, if you were in talk radio, this is a blessing because they will spend now the next 6 months analyzing, debating, splitting hairs over salary cap issues, and they will completely ignore the poor folks, the 6,500 of them who stood out in Maple Leaf Square in the rain. Remember for a couple of those games? Yeah, they missed. Yes. Anyway, I'm glad to hear that the sport radio guys will have plenty to kick around and bitch and moan about. But we're also, the morning after, I think is what is the first sort of organized, specifically official, shall we call it, debate from the mayoral candidates. And it was hosted by our friends at the Daily Bread Food Bank. And there were 5 candidates on the stage. 6 were invited. Mark Saunders decided not to show up. And it was an interesting reaction because when I asked, he said, well, we had another event that we couldn't move. Before all of the names were actually on the ballot, I was told that the Saunders team was not going to encourage the former police chief to get engaged at all or participate at all in these debates. And quite frankly, I'm not sure he's cut out to do that. Now, that might be a good strategy, keep him away from it. But at the end of the day, people are going to be wondering if you really want to be the mayor of this city and you've got some baggage as the former police chief that you're going to have to deal with. Where are you, man? Right? And I think it's a legitimate question. But let's face it, Doug Ford ran a can't see me now campaign, and he ended up back in the premier's chair about a year ago. And the front runners can do that. Olivia Chow, though, in there. And I'll get into the hows and the whys and the wherefores of how that thing played out, because we're going to roll out more of an in-depth version of how they behaved, how they performed, and how they sort of planted flags for each of them and who they see as their immediate threat. But I think the important part of the conversation yesterday was, first of all, that it started with the folks at Daily Bread. And for those of you who have been paying close attention, you'll know that we've been producing podcast series for Neil and his team called the 2030 Project. And essentially, it's about, how do we cope with, how do we deal with, how do we mitigate, reduce, and eradicate poverty in this country? Tough thing to do now that we've gone through the pandemic. And Neil was quick to point out in the introductions last night, they have 270,000 visits to the Daily Bread Food Bank or food banks across the city here in Toronto alone in a month. 270,000 visits. It's an extraordinary number. And so they dealt with, I think, the very issues that we should be talking about in terms of homelessness, poverty, affordable housing, jobs. How do we create a city that is going to be, or recreate a city that is going to be not only accessible, but thrive? So part of this, was all about public safety. It was almost the first thing that came out of their mouths. And it just sort of coincides last week with the Ontario announcement, that Ontario, rather, will be receiving $121 million from the feds to fight guns and gang violence. And that's a great headline. It's a great kind of bumper sticker view of how we're approaching these things. But that's, again, not to dismiss the worries about gun violence in this city. I'm not doing that at all. But it really is a symptom of other things. And I think it was what we heard from the candidates last night in the conversations that they were having. So I'm happy that Owen Charters folks were in my inbox. He's the president and CEO of BGC Canada, formerly Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada, to join us to talk about some of these things. Because, when you think about Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada, Owen, I'm not sure that they would have thought that the subject matter that was being discussed and debated at the mayoral debate last night was necessarily something in your wheelhouse. I tend to think it's probably right where you guys live most days.
Well, Dave, I think you're right. I think you're right on the money with that. And I think a lot of people don't know the extent of what clubs do and what they do across the city of Toronto and all across the country, because a lot of it is, it sounds like it's simple stuff. It's maybe a little bit of recreation and fun after school. But that's pretty much how we started 123 years ago. And that work, believe it or not, by the way, started by off-duty police officers who saw a problem of kids getting into trouble. And that morphed into so much more. And so clubs are now at the epicenter of a lot of what we're seeing and talking about, from poverty issues to the issues of increasing violence. I mean, just yesterday we saw that elementary school teachers were talking about the increase of violence that they're seeing in schools. 80% of them are talking about seeing violence or feeling violence. These are from elementary school kids. This is not high school level. And that's not what's making the headlines. What's unfortunately making the headlines, I think, are youth violence, sort of teenagers and others who are either witnessing it or participating in it, and unfortunately. And our clubs are in the middle of all that, and have been for years, trying to intervene and really give all these youth a different path.
And when you say a different path, it's sort of this hand up, hand out. I mean, that's kind of a cliche and glib way to look at it. But I'll insert sort of the same conversation that I've had with Neil Hetherington at Daily Bread, that day in, day out, there is this mission. There's an incredible group of volunteers and staff that make all of this possible, that support them. And there are always heroic and great stories to tell. As we have gone through the pandemic, give me a sense of the trajectory in terms of how much more of a struggle it has been, or perhaps maybe there have been opportunities that you've seen that you've been able to kind of say, now the path is easier or not.
Well, I mean, the pandemic's had multiple effects on especially on youth. And I think some of it's been, we've talked about in the media, and some of it's been quite hidden. And our slogan is that opportunity changes everything. And the idea is really that youth needed just to see a different path, that they can't just see the sort of idle hands and get into trouble, which is too often the case. If you don't give youth opportunities, they will find opportunities for themselves, and those won't necessarily be very productive ones. But unfortunately, the pandemic really took them down some dark and difficult paths. And I think it especially impacted those who were at that transitional phases. So teenagers who, all those points of time in a teenager's life, like getting your driver's license, graduating from high school, there's a lot of markers for teens at that point that mark transitions to adulthood and independence that you're gaining. And a lot of those were ripped away because those youth didn't get to participate in those. They didn't get to go to grad together. They got a lawn sign if they were lucky. But they didn't, nothing told them that they were transitioning into more independent adults. And I think what we also saw was that a lot of youth, unfortunately, were exposed to some very negative influences that might have been, say, home life that wasn't the best, but also families that didn't have any economic certainty. So you had a lot of parents who were dealing with both shift work, but also loss of jobs. So we saw, for instance, our clubs also do food programs. They hand out food packages to families. And one of the clubs, I remember it was like a Thursday afternoon was when they do the handouts. And when I went to see, the lineup went down the street and around the block. And that was continuing day in and day out at clubs. And they hadn't seen this kind of demand. We had a club in Montreal that had gone from, I think it was about 100 families they support. They opened their doors one morning and it was 1,000 families down the street. And that's just talking about food needs, academic supports, learning loss. We have kids suffering from all kinds of mental health challenges now because they didn't get the supports they needed. They saw parents that struggled who ended up either dealing with addictions. We have an opioid epidemic going on across this country. And these kids are witnesses to this, if not participants. And that's been the hard fight, the hard slog that clubs are now fighting to say, we need to save these kids and show them there's something else other than what they've been experiencing really for the last 3 years.
I talked to John Wright at Maru Public Opinion last week, and they published their sort of quarterly report on the household index, is the kind of what's really affecting people at the kitchen table. And he identified, needless to say, the majority of the people in this country look at their economic and their financial outlook is relatively tilts negative. But, 45% in some parts of the country think that things are going to get better. But when he drills down on the demographics, that 18 to 34-year-old group is the one that seems to, I use the word bleak advisedly because I don't want to sound like we're, overstating this, but there is a bleakness about their outlook in terms of where they're going to find that financial stability, where do they see any level of opportunity and support, whether it's from government or other agencies. And I suggested to John that demographic is, to some degree, at the higher end, has had the double punch. They had the punch of the 08-09 economic crisis. They saw what that did to their parents. Now they're into young adulthood, coming out of their teens, and holy cow, I mean, what the hell did we do to deserve this? Are you seeing any of that kind of trickled through? Because there would be folks who would be in that demographic who would have gone through your program. Do you get a sense of that from them?
Yeah, well, I think I actually see two sides from it. One is a positive side. I just came back from some of our youth leaders came together on the West Coast over the weekend and spent time with about 100 of our youth who are about 18 to 22 years old. And they were talking, some of them are quite optimistic about what the possibilities are. And they want to see change and they're going to lead that change. But at the same time, they talk about the fact that their peers back at their clubs struggle with both mental health issues because it's not just the 2008, 2009 recession. Then they've encountered inflation. Then they encountered what they think is maybe another coming recession. So economically, not great times for them. Plus, no one's seen the kind of lockdowns that happened during the pandemic. So they've experienced the idea that, society works in a very different way and not, we all hoped it would be more collaborative. And I think what they're seeing is actually it's the opposite, that it is more each person for themselves, on top of which a lot of anxiety about climate change. So we see youth who just say, look, what you've handed off to us is a complete mess, from our economic prospects to the environment we're going to live in and the weather we're going to experience to social cohesion. Thanks a lot. So some go down a pretty dark path. And I think they are wondering about their participation in employment and whether that's even worth it. What are their opportunities? And others just think they've got a pretty heavy lift in terms of what they need to do, and that politicians haven't been listening to them for quite some time. They've said some nice words about environmental impact and things they'll do, but they're not doing anything radical enough, fast enough. So they feel like it's that they're not truly being listened to, and I think that's a real shame that we have this generation that feels like. And there have been surveys that have shown youth are less hopeful than they've been in generations past. And that's if there's any generation that's supposed to be our optimistic group, it's our youth. They're the ones who are idealistic and hopeful. And that's a real problem. we need to counteract that sentiment, that feeling that's happening for a lot of our youth.
Well, and it's funny, the ones that are sort of stilting it are viewed themselves as this, culturally innovative, groundbreaking group, being the baby boomers. And I'm sort of on the back end of that, but I can see that without that level of enthusiasm, a level of engagement, nothing really, like our politics goes moribund. All of these things just kind of wilt and wither. And it's not that the things die right away. It's that sort of slow, whoa, well, what the hell? I don't give a damn attitude. The apathy is what's really hard to fight.
Apathy's hard to fight. And I think on top of apathy, I mean, you just look at the political environment, especially south of the border, which is infecting the Canadian side too. I think youth are seeing, and they see it up front. They don't need to look at the news. They don't watch the news, in fact. They just see it on social media. They see it on TikTok and Instagram. And they see that, idealism that they might have is being attacked all over the place. So it's a bit of a why bother? Or if you're going to bother, you really better dig in for a tough fight, because you're going to have a tough skin if you want to actually change anything. And I think that's not a great message to be sending our youth.
No,
that
not at
this
all.
is good luck trying to change anything, because people it doesn't seem to matter what you try to do. Someone's going to attack you, and you're going to be canceled because of the things you want to stand up for and the things you want to say. So, I mean, this is where, clubs are trying to give them all the tools they can. I talked a lot this weekend with our youth about giving them a platform and amplifying their voice with those who are decision makers. So, like at debates last night, are they listening to the youth? Are the candidates for mayor in Toronto listening to what's happening? Is the provincial government, is the federal government? I mean, the Prime Minister has a youth council. I'm not sure how active that is anymore. And I'm not sure that we're seeing a lot of progress on some of the issues that the youth really care about. So
when you talk about, sort of that, are they listening? Listening is one thing. Being heard is something else. I mean, not to draw too fine a point, I think. But when you look at that big number, even last week, everybody was saying, that's the great thing to do. We're going to make sure that we get the guns and the gangs off the street. And much of that, the implication is much of that problem is youth, and is that sort of in the youth demographic. I guess it sort of appeals to a guy, the guys my age, to say, yeah, kick their ass and get those punks off the street. And I suppose to some degree there's, a valid argument or a context for that discussion. But I wonder how, those youth who live in those communities respond to that.
Well, what I see is they're very concerned that a lot of this funding that we're seeing, and we saw the first tranche go straight to municipalities who made their own levels of investment, and a lot of that ended up in policing. And policing is great. We're going to need some strong policing because we've got some big problems. But what we're not doing is we're not hitting at the root of the problem, and that's what the youth would say, is that no, you're coming at us after the problems have been created. And you're resolving it in a way that is with force, with police meeting those who have fallen off the edge already. How do you stop them from falling off the edge? And I think that's where our clubs live, is how do you deal with this? And we did this already. It's like we don't learn the lesson. Ontario had the Summer of the Gun, again, right about 2007, 2008. And it said investments in youth programs will stem the tide. And the research showed that investments in youth programs did, in fact, stem the tide. So 5 years later, you had fewer youth participating in gangs. You had fewer shootings. And politicians said, this is great. What a great outcome. Crime is down. Let's stop the investment. Time to move on. And of course, what do you get? 5 years later, you get another increase in crime. And the cycle continues. And I think we're right now, especially with the pandemic, at the height of a wave on this, where, again, what my real concern is a lot of that funding will end up back in the sort of might makes right model, instead of investing in youth programs, where we can actually see that a youth who's sitting there thinking about what are his opportunities. Does he want to do shifts, in retail or in a fast food place? Or there's this other fellow on the street who says, hey, listen, for $100, can you stand on the street corner? These are, 10-year-olds. For $100, stand on the street corner and just text me if you see a police officer coming. It's an easy $100. Doesn't have to do retail, can still hang out with his friends. And that turns into one more favor, one more thing to do. And eventually you've got a kid who is involved in a gang and doesn't know how to get out. And our work is often gang intervention, but also making sure that that 10-year-old isn't standing on the street corner at the end of the day or on the weekend and sees all kinds of other opportunities that lead to possibilities, lead to employment, lead to better academics, just playing sports. And for a lot of neighborhoods, that's what's missing, is that alternative path. And that's what clubs are supposed to be about. And that's where I'm afraid the investment will not go. It will end up going to the obvious thing that you just talked about. Let's just invest in putting more police cars on the street and trying to show some force.
Well, I again go back to that year of the gun and the crackdowns and the Fantino era in Toronto, and to your point, it worked. I put that in air quotes for those of you following along at home. And the 5-year cycle is interesting on two levels. First is that it's complete. Okay, we can kind of move some of that money around. It also happened to be about the time that a lot of those gangsters who were in jail got out of jail. And all of a sudden, you had a perfect storm there, coming back to an environment that actually grew them to begin with.
Well, it seems like we invest in the wrong cycles, right? We invest in those sort of crime and justice, crime and punishment models versus what we think of as opportunity and possibility. And it costs us a lot as a society to invest in that. And we have research that shows, for a dollar versus $100 that you want to invest in the criminal justice system, you can actually get youth out of that cycle. Because once they're in that cycle, to your point, it's very hard to get them out. We've worked with a few folks who've come out of gangs, come out of jail and said, look, you're some of the best people to talk to youth about. You don't want to be in that lifestyle. That lifestyle, a lot of gang members will actually say that wasn't their choice. It was something they fell into. Yeah. It was easy. And they'll tell you, look, once you're in that life, there's things you can't do in your gang. Even if you were a former gang member, there's parts of the city you're not allowed to go to. There's a target on your back. But we've had kids say that. They're out on a field trip with their club and we go to cross the street and they're like, oh, I'm not allowed to cross this street because that side is this gang territory and I'm only allowed on this side. And you're talking about, a 10, a 12-year-old who says, I can't go to that neighborhood. And you're saying, well, this is absolutely unacceptable that at this age, these sorts of choices are being made by these kids. And so we need to stop the cycle. And I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing is political investment that looks at 4 to 5 year windows, at election cycles, and says, what do we need to do to get reelected? So we'll invest in the obvious, the policing side of things. And, policing is necessary, but there seems to be, for every $10 that goes into policing, maybe $1 goes into youth programs, often a lot less. And I think the federal government right now is kind of shirking its responsibility. It's saying, look, we're going to put all this money on the table, but we're going to let it flow down to the local levels. So our challenge as an organization across the country is now we've got to go to every city council and make the case that youth programs are the better investment for some of those dollars. And the feds have sort of washed their hands of that and said, we wrote the check, so everyone else has to make the decision. So there's also a lack of cohesion and systematic approach to fixing this problem at any level.
So let me turn that around. I may be asking you something that you don't have your thumb on. I doubt it, but let me ask. Because you talked about all the research that you have done. I did some work with the folks at Habitat for Humanity, and Boston Consulting did a report for them. This is a number of years ago now, that said that the ROI on investing in affordable housing, for every dollar you invest, they donated, for example, to Habitat for Humanity, they could turn that into a $4 ROI. So it's fairly significant in terms of social ROI. And I think you guys are kind of in the same neighborhood, and literally and figuratively, on that. Do you have a sense, if, for example, if I were to drop that $121 million in your lap, what would the return be on that? Can you guys measure that in terms of sort of that social return on investment?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you what the cost is, and I can tell you the impact. I actually haven't priced out the impact, but you can take a pretty good estimate based on what I'm about to tell you. It's about $1,000 to keep a kid in a club for a year. So for every kid that stays for 365 days, it's $1,000 cost, all in, everything. Which is a pretty good program. You can't even get daycare in Toronto for that amount, even with the $10 a day daycare program. So that's your investment. We have a study that came out of our Winnipeg club that looked at what happens when a youth participates in a club for even just half a year. So that's a $500 investment. And if they saw they came regularly, so at least 3 days a week to the club, what they did was they compared this against youth in the same neighborhood, same postal codes, who did not go to a club, and they saw that the rates of involvement in the criminal justice system went to zero. And I'm not pulling it out of the air. This was researched by the University of Winnipeg, in Manitoba, University of Manitoba, and they said this actually drops to zero. So you're talking about a kid who otherwise, you're talking about incarceration, you're talking about policing, you're talking about all the costs related. You're talking about one youth for $500 that has zero involvement in that. But on top of that, we saw increased outcomes in their educational attainment, so completing high school, and better health outcomes when it came to the health system. So this is meaning teenage pregnancies dropped to practically zero. Sexually transmitted diseases drop to really negligible levels for those youth that participate. So knock-on savings across the system are really significant. And we didn't even measure further on what happens when it comes to housing and employment. But we were able to access government data that showed these youth this is the most effective inoculation you can have. So you can only imagine the savings that it might be for any youth that participates in a program like that.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate and suggest that some of that might well be because just of the character of a kid who would get involved in a club lends itself to that behavior, i.e. not going to jail, not having, drug use or whatever it might be.
I would have the same argument at times, go, well, come on, this must be the selective kids who go. Right. But what we actually see is a lot of kids, they're not so happy to come in the door the first time. What is the best way to get a kid in a club is often, and I'm going to say it's a mom, because it usually is a single mom who says, I'm worried about my kids. I'm worried about the direction they're going. And I've heard the club's one of the best ways to intervene. And the club, they often describe, the kids describe the club as their other parent, their missing parent, because a lot of these kids come from single parent families. So, or it's a school principal or a teacher who said, you know what, I'm seeing you start to go down a certain path, and I'm just going to make a suggestion that you come in and meet this club. And what's fascinating is the ability of club staff to engage youth that are reluctant attendees at the beginning. So there's lots of kids who love to go because they get to do cooking class and they get to do swimming and they get to do everything else. But quite a number, especially in these neighborhoods, who in they come because someone said, look, we see that you need an alternative. Or as another good example, a club we have in Montreal, where so many kids love to play basketball. They love to, and what we do is we build some of the best courts so that's where they want to be. So the kids are, no questions asked, come on in, play basketball. So a lot of teenage boys would come in, play basketball. And as they do it slowly, there's a bit of an intervention that the staff play out. It's not immediate. It takes months, but start to get to know all of them. That's our goal, is you've got to know them by name, know their families. And the big test is that there's one ticket to ride when you play basketball in a club. And that's, you got to bring your report card in on report card day. And it's not because we care if you're failing or not failing. It's because we need to show that we care about you as a whole person. And for some of those kids, that's the first time anyone's asked to see their report card.
Wow.
And the point of it is, again, not that, a D in history, you should get your grades up. It's it's simply someone cares about all the dimensions of who you are and how you're developing as a person. And so we find that if you lower the barriers to entry, kids come because they want to have fun. They want to play on a really nice court that Jay's Care Foundation invested to renovate that court. It was beautiful. So the kids want to get off the street and play in the best place. It's safe. There's concrete walls around them. Guns can't come in. So even if you're in that lifestyle, this is a safe place for at least an hour. And then someone starts to show that they actually care about you and that there's possibilities for you other than what you might be seeing on the street. So there's, I hate to say it's a bit of a trick, but you'd be surprised at the ways our clubs have of getting kids in off the street.
Well, we say this all the time. I think the real strength in dealing with so many of these issues is creating community. I mean, you can't do it without community, period.
That's right.
Any of that stuff. So a couple things just before we go. I don't want to keep you too long, but now I notice, in the headline here, President CEO BGC Canada, formerly Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada. Why the shift there? What's the?
That's a good question. So we heard it from the youth first. The youth said to us, "Hey, a couple problems with your name. Boys and girls." We find that there's a lot of youth come in from the LGBTQ2 plus community who are trans and are saying, look, that doesn't represent me. Two, we just talked a lot about teens. And we have quite a cohort of teenagers that come in the club and they go, boys and girls, that's a little, I want to be at a place that sounds a little more appropriate to the age cohort we're in.
Right.
And we were looking at alternatives for, do we just rebrand for those teen folks that are attending? And so did a real deep dive on, and I think the other thing is actually what we just talked about at the beginning. People don't fully understand what clubs do. And that the name Boys and Girls Clubs meant for a lot of people basketball after school, but not a lot else. And we are so complex now. We're really a social service agencies for youth, from drug rehab and counseling to homeless shelters and food, like we talked about. So we said, let's answer the call that those youth are asking of us. We'll rebrand to BGC. I mean, this is the same as many other organizations. All the banks did it. They all went to an acronym. And the Y did it many, many years ago, kind of by accident. So we went to BGC and said, look, we're open for everybody. And it also gives us a fresh start to talk about the work we do in a more expansive, more complex way of the broad nature of services our clubs provide.
So, and I just want to kind of circle back as we've finished in terms of that broadened perspective, the broadened mission there of the clubs. And are there areas of the country rather where I'm assuming there's not bespoke clubs, but that would speak more specifically to the needs of a particular community, whether it might be in Northern Ontario or, right, the interior in British Columbia, right?
Well, I do say, and this is one of the unique factors of clubs, and I'm famous for saying, once you've seen one club, you've only seen one club, because our model is a little bit more tailored to each community. So there's a lot of latitude for each club, a central mission and standards and service requirements that each club has to meet from a national level, but a lot more tailoring to what those needs are in the community. So if you go to North Battlefords in Saskatchewan, actually very heavy gang activity. A lot of it, unfortunately, coming from First Nations and all reserve. So a lot more work with Indigenous youth, very tailored to be culturally appropriate, but they're seeing a couple of years ago, their headline was they had the highest crime rate in the country. And when I visited, they said, we're so embarrassed about this. What do we do? These were sort of community leaders. And we said, look, it's not that different from what we're seeing all over the place. And a lot of interior communities are actually seeing very high crime rates, unfortunately. So as you mentioned, interior BC, some of the same issues, but also very different approaches to trauma, very different approaches to issues from, multi-generational trauma from residential schools and onwards that we have to deal with. But really interesting lessons learned when you apply that to inner city programs, where those kids see very different kinds of trauma and needs. So we are seeing that, the homelessness piece, especially youth housing, was very prevalent in the West Coast for a long time. A lot of transient youth went to Kelowna, went to BC. It was nice in the summer and you could kind of maybe pick up some time skiing in the winter. But then you ended up out of a job. And so our housing programs started out west and are slowly migrating east across the country. But it was, we pick up and share programs from coast to coast based on who's doing it best and who's got some new ideas. So, yeah, very tailored depending on the community.
How often then do communities specifically reach out to you? I mean, you talk about kids being referred to the club by principals and parents. I'm guessing it goes the other way as well.
It goes always. I mean, we've got kids coming in all the time. Our biggest challenge right now is just we can't meet the waiting list demands. We can't find the staff. We can't find the trained folks that we need. We can't even find youth employees for some of the programs we want to run. So the demand far outstrips the supply at the moment. But also our ability to connect those youth to services across the community is central to what we do. And that's where we're also seeing a heavy load on the system right now across the country. Children's aid services, family support services, they're all at capacity. So we're trying to get kids into supportive programs. And often we're really we're the safety net, trying to catch all the eggs that are falling as best we can, realizing that safety net right now is pretty broken.
So let me ask you, I've heard from other groups, even the other day we talked to the folks at Daily Bread, and there's almost this existential threat, I'll use the phrase,
yes,
for so many of these, social safety net groups. Before pandemic, we're able to manage. Since pandemic, capacity is just off the charts. Demand is way overboard. Government support is less than what it should be. And even if, we're going to help you make sure that you meet your demand, is not necessarily the answer to the solution. What does the club's future look like, 3-5 years from now? What do you need?
Well, that's a really great question. I mean, look, we need funders, and that means governments. It also means private philanthropy to understand that upstream solutions are going to be the solution. If they don't start investing in the next generation, instead of just intervening once the problem's created, I think we're just going to see a massive problem on our hands. And so our need, I mean, in one version, our work will be only get busier and busier. The needs will only grow the way we're seeing things go. We're facing the same kinds of problems that Neil talks about for food banks. The need just continues to grow, and we can't build clubs fast enough. And we need to build clubs anyway, just to deal with the needs of today's communities or yesterday's communities. But I think the real problem is, will decision makers understand that the funding has to go upstream? You're not going to solve poverty by fixing those who have fallen off the cliff over and over and over. Those are very expensive solutions. We need to do that work, but I think it's the same as policing. You can invest a lot of money in it, but it's a very expensive solution. If decision makers understood the benefit of having a 10-year view, a 20-year view, and investing early on, we will see these problems start to diminish. That's a guarantee. It's proven in research that youth programs change outcomes for society. And if only we had lots of folks who really understood that kind of intervention makes more sense than trying to put out the fires.
Where should we go to help?
Well, bgccan.com is our national website. It's a great way to learn more about our programs, and you can help directly. You can also help at local clubs. We've got clubs across the country, 650 locations. They each have a website. They each have physical locations. Great to see the work. Great to get involved. And of course, they need your support.
Owen, thanks for being generous with your time, and we'll want to touch base again as we kind of wade through some of these various versions of government announcements. There will be more. There's elections right across the country, it seems, but the idea that the likes of you and the nonprofit sector is being called upon to carry an increasing burden and load. I'm not sure most of us are really aware of, it's great that you're there. The worry is what will happen if you weren't.
Well, Dave, it's my pleasure to do this. And I think you're absolutely right. We need to better tell our story so that this type of investment gets to where it's needed. And thank you so much for helping us tell it.
Good of you to join us. Thanks, Owen.
Great. Thank you.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.